and welcome everyone to this new IB webinar, which will begin in a couple of minutes, just to let everybody join here on Zoom. For those who are new to the IBE, our purpose is to champion the highest standards of ethical behavior in business. And we do this through advocacy, training, research, and thought leadership, but also by convening events and networks to share and promote good practice like we're doing today. There are a lot of resources that are available on our website, most of which are freely accessible. So please do take a look at it if you haven't done so yet. In today's webinar, we will try to answer the question, how can we build an ethical culture, which is exactly the title that we have chosen for this event. And I am here with an excellent panel of very experienced people who have done a lot of work on this topic, and they will share with us some thoughts, insights, and examples in a moment. I suspect that probably we will not be able to give you the ultimate answer to the question of how to build an ethical culture in the time we have today, but we do hope that you will be able to take away some new ideas and some useful examples from the conversations today. So I see that a few more people are joining in, so welcome to the webinar, which will be focused, as I was saying, on the topic of corporate culture, and in particular, we will discuss how to build an ethical culture in an organization. This is a topic that we've been working on for a while here at the IBE. If you have a look at our website, you will find a few pieces of work that we have done on this in the past. We have a series of what we called board briefings, which as the name suggests, are aimed at more board members, but also at practitioners who have regular engagement with the board. And our late colleague, Peter Montagnon, did a lot of research on how to ensure that issues of ethics and culture are meaningfully covered in the boardroom. And now, building on that, we're doing some more research on the latest trends and developments in the approach to corporate culture, obviously through the ethics lens. And we've also contributed to a new report on culture that will be published probably next week by the Financial Reporting Council as well. So I think we are almost all here now, so welcome to all those who have joined us. While the last few people join us here on Zoom, I'll start by introducing myself briefly. My name is Guen Dondé, and I'm head of research here at the IBE. A very warm welcome to our panelists as well, and thank you so much for being with us today. We have with us Beunza, who is Associate Professor of Management at Bayes Business School. His research explores the way in which social relations and technology shape financial value. One of his most recent books, which is called Taking the Floor, Models, Morals and Management in a Wall Street Trading Room, which considers the moral consequences of the use of economic models on Wall Street, won the 2020 Eagles Best Book Award and the Terry Best Book Award at the Academy of Management. Daniel has done some very interesting work on organizational culture, which he will share with us today. Among other things, he collaborated with the UK Financial Services Culture Board in the use of ethnography and grounded theory research to enhance professional standards in the UK's financial sector. So thank you, Daniel, for being with us. Welcome also to Debbie Allen, who is Director, Governance, Conduct and Sustainability at BAE Systems. Debbie joined BAE Systems in 2001 as Director of Safety, Health and Environment, and her role quickly expanded to include corporate responsibility and business governance of the group. And she was instrumental in establishing the standards for ethical business conduct in BAE Systems and across the defense sector. So now her role encompasses the many and varied aspects arising from the ESG issues that affect the company. And she works very closely with the company's executives and the board to drive the ESG agenda within the business. So welcome, Debbie. And then finally, last but not least, Roger Farley is colleague strategy and insight, colleague experience and HR transformation, people and transformation at NatWest Group. Roger has been employed for NatWest for over 40 years, during which has had a wide and varied career. He's a chartered banker as well as a fully qualified HR professional. And after a variety of training and development roles in HR, Roger has spent the last 5 years defining and developing the framework for measuring and reporting on culture in a large and complex organization such as NatWest. And the reports produced using this framework are discussed at the executive committee and boards of NatWest Group. So thank you, Roger, for being with us. I will leave the floor to our panelists, obviously, in a moment. But before that, let me just say that we would like to hear from you as well as much as possible. We would like to encourage you to ask questions and share your thoughts with us at any point during the webinar. Please use the Q&A box here on Zoom. It is also possible to submit a question anonymously if you prefer, and you can also vote on other questions or comment on other questions as well. I will keep an eye on the Q&A box and we will address your questions and comments as we go along. And in fact, usually I'd like to start with a question for all of you that are listening today. And the question that I'd like to ask you today is the following. In your view, what are the main challenges or main pitfalls that organizations face when it comes to building an ethical culture? You can put your answer in the Q&A box. And so the question is, in your view and in your experience, what are the main challenges that organizations need to face when they want to build an ethical culture? And in the meantime, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. I hope that Zoom will work well for everyone today, but if you have any technical issues, please submit those via the chat function. Our events team is on hand available to help. So Q&A box for the questions and comments and the chat function for any technical issues that you might have, please. I will also keep an eye on Twitter. We will be live tweeting throughout the event, so please feel free to share any thoughts or comments on Twitter as well. Our handle is @IBUK. A recording of the webinar will be made available in the next couple of days, and this will be also shared via the IB website. So without further ado, let me start with you, Daniel. As I mentioned in the introduction, the key question we are trying to answer today is how can we build an ethical culture within an organization? So can you tell us a bit more about the research that you have done on this and perhaps share with us some takeaways from it that can help us answer this question?
Thank you, Gwen. Thank you for the question, which in fact, it's a highly relevant question. The first point that I would like to make is that cultural change is difficult. And in most cases, it actually does not work. So it's interesting when you find a situation when where the cultural change actually takes place. So the book that I recently published, the title is Taking the Floor, Models, Morals, and Management in a Wall Street trading floor, engages with one case in which cultural change was indeed effective. And so the book is about, it's a 16-year-long qualitative research project in which I engage with an executive in an experiment that this executive performed. And so the story dates back to the mid-1990s and the now infamous derivatives scandals in various banks on Wall Street. Towards the end of the decade, the bank where this executive worked, which was one of the leading banks in the derivatives space, ended up disappearing due to the scandals. And when the executive, whom I call Bob as a pseudonymous reference, when the executive took a new job at a new bank as the head of the equity derivatives trading floor, he introduced a number of measures. Back then, I was a young PhD student looking out for a trading floor in which to conduct ethnographic observations, to perform field work. And I ended up spending 3 years studying what this gentleman, Bob, was doing in his trading floor. I didn't understand at the time that all this was in response to the scandals that he had confronted early on. I only understood this later on in 2008, when I noticed that the practices that the media was portraying about what was going on Wall Street was so different from the behaviors that I had seen in the trading floor that I had studied. So I conducted my first study between 1999 and 03. And then in 2008, I decided to return to the field and return to Bob and to the traders that I had followed to fully understand what is it that Bob had done to eliminate the type of behaviors that were portrayed and condemned in the media during the 2008 financial crisis. So the first thing that I noticed is that Bob was very concerned about justice and ethics. And so back then, when I was initially observing on the trading floor, I tended to assume that the key motivation for traders and managers in finance would be incentives. But what I quickly realized is that Bob was aware that issues such as the perception of being unfairly treated or unfairly paid could be very powerful, and they had to be addressed, and practices such as compensation practices had to be, if necessary, altered so as to prevent unnecessary perceptions of injustice. As I further delved into what was being done in the trading floor, what I noticed was that Bob was primarily reacting to the perception of injustice that he had detected among traders when they were subjected to the controls imposed by risk management. So typically what happens is that risk management systems limit positions and force traders to close positions once the expected risk levels go beyond a certain threshold. And that was creating a sense that the best trades were being blocked by the bank. And that was in turn creating a sense of a perception of injustice. This phenomenon, which is known in the literature as moral disengagement, was something that Bob was keen on addressing. And so what he did was, as he took control of the trading floor, he started out by communicating his goals and the things that mattered to him, and developing a rhetoric around the importance of adhering to certain ethical standards. He then replaced a very substantial number of people. And in fact, he even stopped a number of products being offered because he felt that they posed too big of a temptation for managers. He then deployed a managerial approach of direct engagement and conversation with the traders on the floor, and spent time going from one desk to the other, talking to them. Created a managerial structure of people under him that would make sure that the internal norms that Bob wanted the traders to follow were followed. And he also decided to do away, not take into account the data used by the risk management system, and instead stop traders' position only on the basis of his own conversations with them or those of the middle managers under him. And so if I was to sum up what I saw, I proposed the concept of proximate control as a means to put in place cultural change. And this is the practice of relying on direct managerial contact or as close as possible to the people to impart the formal norms that are being pursued.
Thanks very much, Daniel. And just very briefly, actually, I wanted to put to you a question that we have received from one of our listeners, because I think it will be relevant to what you just described. one of our listeners asked whether an ethical code of conduct would be a good way to encourage cultural change or adherence to the organization's espoused values. And at the IB, I know that we do a lot of work on codes, and we have recently published, for example, a study that is based on the analysis of the codes of the FTSE 100 companies here in the UK. So it is a topic that we're definitely interested in, but I was wondering whether this is something that you have come across in your research at all.
Yeah, so codes of conduct, such as statements by the banks about what values they are emphasizing and what type of behaviors are ideal, I think that they are one leg of a cultural transformation process. And this can be summed up as the rhetoric and meaning the words that are being communicated. The challenge then is to integrate that rhetoric with a couple of things. One is the structure of the organization. Is a company willing to alter the strategy in order to address ethical issues, moral issues, cultural issues? The other one is that it also needs to speak to the face-to-face conversations and interactions that the managers and the employees are having on a day-to-day basis. So I would say that the code of conduct is one leg. It needs to be integrated and complemented. And if it isn't, there's a real danger that employees might perceive that code of conduct as an exercise in impression management, or perhaps even ended up experiencing some cynical sense. So it is a tool, but it has to be used carefully.
Thanks very much. And I think some of the things you mentioned just now as potential challenges also are reflected in the comments that we are receiving from our audience in terms of the main challenge or what the organizations need to face in building an ethical culture. Failing to move from good intentions to actions is one that perhaps could be announced if the code is just sort of a PDF to have, right, and something that is embedded in the business. A few people comment on lack of tone from the top, of lack of engagement from the leaders in the business. And we also have a few people that mention the issues around ensuring that the culture is consistent in a global business and even across different business units, domestically diverse, multinational workforce, etc. So a lot of interesting things. And then a lot of people also mentioned the issue of measuring culture as well, that we will address in a moment. But let me move on to you, Roger. I mentioned earlier that you have done a lot of work actually on this issue that I just mentioned of measuring and assessing culture, and to develop a framework to assess the culture and report on culture. And I'd like to ask you more about that a bit later on. But before we get there, I'd like to put to you basically the same question that I asked Danielle. So how can we build an ethical culture? Can you share with us a bit about what the journey that NatWest went through to develop its culture strategy is? And also, I'd like to add a question that we have received from, again, one of our listeners. Who are the key stakeholders that you need to involve in this process, if you may?
That's a great follow-up question. Thank you for having me. Good morning, everybody, and thank you to Daniel for the opening answer, which I can build on a bit. I think NatWest, or RBS as was, obviously has been on a huge cultural journey over the last decade or so. At one time we're probably seen as the poster child for everything that was wrong in UK banking. And I recognise a lot of the issues that Daniel talked about there in terms of, the accusation that bankers put themselves and their own greed first rather than customers first. So this is a cultural issue that's familiar to me, and having lived through it for a number of years, I can tell you a little bit about what I think NatWest has done well in this regard. So in terms of the specific answer to your question about how to build an ethical culture, what we believe is that that comes from what we believe is that it's about living our purpose. And we had a new chief executive came into post, Alison Rose, last year, who set out her new vision and her purpose, which is that we champion potential, helping people, families and businesses to thrive. So the purpose is the sort of direction of travel, but that's backed up with the question that you had about codes of conduct. And our code has sort of 4 elements to it. The how we work piece, which is how we move towards our purpose. So what are the areas of focus that we're going to look at? So for us, it's climate, the role we play in transition to a net zero carbon economy, learning, how we improve financial capability for our customers, and enterprise, how we remove barriers to those who are starting businesses. So those 3 aims underpin that overall purpose of championing potential to help people, families and businesses to thrive. So that's one element of our code. The other elements are how we make decisions. And this has been a really powerful element of our code of conduct. We've got something called the yes check. And it's 5 simple questions that if anybody in the organization is faced with a difficult decision, that they can refer to and discuss with a colleague or just discuss internally with themselves. So simple questions, but really, really powerful. So what would others say? Would others say that I'm acting with respect and integrity? Does what I'm doing keep the bank, our customers, and our communities safe? Am I acting fairly and being inclusive? Have I sought different perspectives? And will this advance our purpose? So when anybody's faced with a sort of ethical dilemma or a difficult decision, they can refer to those questions and go through them almost as a tick box, or as we call it, a yes check, to make sure that what they're doing meets those criteria and is right for our customers, our communities, and the organisation overall. That's also underpinned by how we behave in the organisation, and 2 elements to that. One is the FCA conduct rules, which all banks have to adhere to, but also our own internal critical people capabilities, so the competencies that we use. And then finally, as part of our code, are all the policies that we follow to make sure that we adhere correctly to the policies and procedures of the organisation. So 2 main elements of how we're trying to build an ethical culture is following that purpose that I've outlined and adhering to the code that's got those elements that I've just described. The follow-up question, can you repeat that again, Gwen? What was that question?
Yeah, of course. So who are the key stakeholders that you need to involve in this process?
I don't want to sound glib on this, but it's everybody. So it is from our board, our executives, our line managers, the people who are working with our customers and the wider community of which the bank is part of. And that's one thing that I'm feeling quite proud of, having been, joining a small Scottish bank, regional bank, when I was 17 years old, to still being here now. It felt when I joined the bank that there was much more connection to the community that we operated in. And along the way, somehow, I think that probably got lost a little bit. But I'm now feeling that feeling that we have got a lot to give to the community and a lot to learn from our communities that we operate in. And that piece of our overall strategy now to connect with our communities feels a much better position, a much more ethical position for us to be in now.
Thanks very much, Roger. That's really, really helpful. Debbie, let me come to you next. BAE Systems obviously operates in a very different space compared to NatWest. It is a different sector, a different organization. So how have you and how has BAE System approached the task of building an ethical culture? What are the key considerations there from your point of view?
It's always a challenge of going last or third. Is a lot of all the good stuff has already been said by the previous panelists, but I'll have a go. And I guess like Roger's opening bit about NatWest maybe being the poster child for all that wasn't great in the banking industry, BAE Systems held that role within the defence sector for some time as well. Added to that, the defence sector itself is seen as a poster child of not all that's great by some who I would say don't properly understand what we do. But that's perception and everyone's entitled to their view. So we had a number of challenges to overcome. And this sort of dates back over 10 years ago when really had to go back to basics. It had been a company, it wasn't a small company, but I think it had relied on, well, everybody knows what good looks like. We'll all do the right thing because we all care about each other and all those sort of things. And actually the company got rather large and was working all over the place, and you can't rely on that one. So we had to go right back to basics and rewrite every single policy and process and make sure that it reflected the way we really wanted to work. So I think the key thing starting off at the top is leadership. You've got to have that commitment from the top. The board is important, but it's got to be the executive, the people who are making the decisions, managing, etc. They've got to be leading it, as they did with ours. You've got to set the standards, which is we had to reset our standards and say, this is what we expect. This is what good looks like or great looks like within BAE Systems. This is what it means in operating in all these different areas across all these different policies. We do that through our code of conduct and all the associated policies and processes. We're an engineering company, so we're never short of a process to back things up. Then you have to look at what the important, if something's important to the company, how does it manifest itself? If you don't want it to be a bolt-on or a comms campaign, look at other things. So, okay, delivery of financial results. How do we know that's important? Chief exec, CFO, they talk about it a lot. They set targets. They set objectives on it, measurable objectives, and they keep going on about it throughout the year, and they hold people to account. So you have to do the same in terms of setting an ethical culture. If it's important to the company, it has to manifest itself through the company strategy, the executive objectives, the objectives that are rolled down. It's part of people's performance review. It's part of everything you do. Now, it doesn't happen overnight. So I guess the other things are that you have to keep going at this one. You have to, once you've got all that framework set up, is how do you actually do it? And I think both previous speakers have touched on that engagement. It's everybody. And you've got to make it real to people. You've got to take it into their world and say, what does this mean to me at this time? So you've got to work out, and one of the ways we do it is through our ethics training, which is scenario based. So rather than online training, although we do have that, I won't try and claim that we solved the panacea of compliance training without online tick boxing, but that every year we run all employee training, which is based on scenarios, an amalgamation of things that have probably come up through our ethics helpline and all of those things, but taking it into, okay, what issues might arrive in a shop floor environment, what might happen in an office, what might happen in a boardroom, and playing those out and getting people to discuss them. And there's no right or wrong in the discussion. It's just that, ooh, actually, that sort of could happen here, or you know what, that did happen here. So I think you've got to keep that awareness, but you've got to make it really relevant to people. Mm. And I guess the downside of it is you've also got to have consequences. If you mean it, then people aren't doing it right. You've got to have those consequences. You've got to help them raise the issues. We always encourage people to raise issues, and a bit similar to the way Roger outlined with their yes, I forgotten quite what you said, yes check. Yes check, thank you. We have a similar decision tree that we go through, sort of, is this something you'd want your family and friends to know about? Is this something you could do it? Should you do it? All of those things that just say, ugh. And then a lot of advice on where to raise these things and how can you do it. So you've got all of that, but ultimately there has to be consequences. If people raise things through the ethics helpline or to their line manager, they have to know something gets done. So you have to have that, a process that makes sure that happens. And it's one of the things we find a challenge. I know companies, and we've discussed it with the IBE, is you can't always go back to someone who's raised an issue and let them know someone's gone through some disciplinary process, because particularly in the UK, the laws of the land don't allow you to say, oh, don't worry, they've been hauled over the coals and put on the naughty step for some time. But there are ways of it getting out, and there are ways of communicating this. It's not putting poles on spikes at the entrance to headquarters or things, but there are ways of getting out that it does matter. And of course, actions speak louder than words. So if you get particular senior line managers who are known to not have particularly strong behaviours, if they get promoted, that says behaviours don't matter so much. So it's an ongoing process, but it's all of those things, which I think is really a summary of what the previous panelists were saying.
Yeah, definitely the point that you made about ensuring that people know that there are consequences is something that, as you say, we also find in our research, because when we ask people that were aware of something wrong why they didn't say anything about it, one of the things that they say alongside retaliation is that they're worried that nothing will be done about it. So finding ways within what's possible, obviously, to communicate that there are consequences and the things are taken seriously is definitely important. One thing that I wanted to put to you, Debbie, is something that was raised by a couple of our listeners. So we have, for example, Jason says that one of the issues is that people sometimes fail to see the distinction between the ethical culture and compliance-based culture. And Pamela as well, she says there's confusion between culture and compliance. So how do you think these two elements of the culture of an organization, obviously compliance, which is very important, but also the ethical elements of it can go together without kind of avoiding this confusion and making sure that people understand that they're not the same thing in practice?
I don't think they can be totally separated, because compliance with those things that are set by our regulators and customers and others are a requirement, and you have to do them. But I think the difference, they are the you have to. I guess the culture bit is what you choose to do. So tick boxing, I go through I don't tick box it in case any of our lawyers are listening. As a defence company, we've got huge amounts of training that as a senior person required to do, all that online. Have you done this? Do you know this? Do you know that? We all go through it. The cultural bit, though, is the choice bit. That I know the standards of the company. I know what's important. I choose to stay here in the company. So when I'm making decisions about how I behave in a meeting, the tone of my emails, all of that is a choice. It's not a compliance tick box. No, okay, there's consequences if I get it wrong, which I referred to. But I think the culture bit is the choice, but the company sets the boundaries for that choice to happen and what a good outcome should be.
Thanks very much, Debbie. Okay, so what I'd like to talk about next with each of you is the question of assessing culture and measuring progress against the organization's objectives and goals as well. So let me go back to you, Danielle. What does your research suggest on this point? So I'm afraid you're on mute.
That was a classic Zoom situation. Thank you so much for this question. And can I also just quickly weigh in? I think that this difference between compliance and culture is critical, and it speaks to the difference between, on the one hand, rules, and on the other hand, the norms. And it's the norms that are internalized. It really is what people do when no one is looking. That, to me, is the key element of an ethical culture. So I'd like to start by a couple of things. First, highlighting just how critical this question is, the measurement and the assessment of culture. I think that one thing that I would like to add is that in proceeding with this understanding of what is going on inside the organization, I personally found it helpful to differentiate between what is, strictly speaking, culture and what is, strictly speaking, ethics. Normally, I think of ethics as what is right and what is wrong, whereas culture is more about the beliefs and the ways in which people make meaning of specific events and observations and perceptions in an organization. It is true that the way in which the program in reforming ethics has been introduced by regulators and by other industry bodies as cultural standards. But in my view, this serves the desirable purpose of making it into a large sort of like program and embracing of various people. But at the same time, it has the problem of creating some element of confusion. What is culture? What is ethics? So what I'd like to do is I'd like to speak more directly to the question of issues around right and wrong. So the key tool has been the development of culture surveys. And I think that this is a great form of progress. But at the same time, it's important to recognize what are the limitations of the ethical surveys and in what ways can those limitations be addressed and how can they be complemented with other tools. So the shortcomings of ethical surveys date all the way back to 20 years ago, the debates in the academic literature and management between proponents of traditional studies of culture in the sense of anthropologists, so ethnographic studies, fieldwork, and more psychology-based use of surveys, quantitative tools. So there have been debates for now 20 years over the pros and cons of each of these. But I think that the point is that both are useful tools if they are properly integrated. What I have been doing with the Financial Services Culture Board is to complement the use of surveys with the creation of training programs that help executives in banks learn the tools used by anthropologists who are studying remote cultures. So in other words, what I have been doing now, also working with some organizations that have approached me and my business school independently, is to help banks create the internal competences to study culture in the same way that an anthropologist would when, say, taking off from his or her own office in London and moving to some remote village far away. So the use of field work and direct observation of what people do is a great complement to the surveys, because what it does is it allows you, first of all, to add color to those quantitative observations, but also to challenge some of those observations from the survey, or to perhaps refine the questions or to contextualize the findings. And so in doing that, it's a way in which the quantitative approach and the qualitative approach can continuously evolve and inform each other. So I would say that surveys are a terrific tool, but now complementing them with qualitative research tools can provide an even better sense of where the culture is.
Thank you. And I think that's really, really interesting, because probably surveys is something that a lot of organizations kind of provide or are working to provide, but this idea of complementing the results of a survey with some different types of observations and perhaps teaching people to how to see things that are relevant for ethics and culture is definitely something very interesting and very important. So Roger, let me move on to you. And obviously we said that you've done a lot of work on this. So can you tell us a little bit more about the framework that we have developed, and perhaps what are the next steps from here for you?
Yeah, thank you. And I can testify to Daniel's program, because I was a participant on that and found it incredibly helpful. I wouldn't profess to yet being able to be an anthropologist studying the culture in our organization through remote observation, but I do pull together, as you said in your introduction, reports for our main executive committee and board, and also for the major legal entities for the organisation, which try to give them an insight into the way our culture is developing and evolving. So I'll give you a little bit of the story about where this has come from. So it's notoriously hard to do this. Measuring culture is not an easy thing to do. And we first started doing this about 9-10 years ago in the organisation. What had happened was, after the financial crash and bad things happening with banks, we, for the first time in our organisation, introduced a set of values that were consistent across the entire organisation, rather than different businesses having slightly different variations on a theme. We had one consistent set of values across the organisation. And at that point, we were trying to figure out, well, how will we know if these values, which we believed were good and people bought into, how would we know whether they were being consistently applied? So we started out trying to figure out how we could measure the implementation and adherence and belief in these values. And over time, this evolved because what we realized was, by doing that, we weren't really measuring the values, we were actually measuring the culture in the organization. So we widened out our approach, and it's evolved through it's probably now moving into its third, maybe fourth major iteration over time. And when we relaunched the purpose that I mentioned earlier of the organization in February 2020, we in defining that purpose, the organization worked a lot with an organization called the Blueprint for Better Business. And the Blueprint for Better Business has sort of 5 principles of a purpose-driven business, which we wanted to adhere to. They are: has a purpose which delivers long-term sustainable performance, is honest and fair with customers and suppliers, is a good citizen, is a responsible and responsive employer, and as a guardian for future generations. And we thought, as we used that framework to develop our purpose, we thought, do you know what? If that's underpinning our purpose, what we should do is align our measurement framework around those 5 principles. So what I've done is, I have pulled together a framework which reports against those 5, through those 5 lenses. And what we do is we track around 120 different metrics of a variety of kinds to ensure that we get coverage into each of those 5 principles, and are reporting twice a year to each of these boards and committees whether we think we're good on that, that's green, or whether we're kind of got more work to do, whether there's a hot spot that we've identified through our data. And the types of data that we use in this framework is, to the point Daniel made, it's quite extensive. It's not just colleague surveys, although that's a hugely important part of it. We also use the ratings agency data that we get from a number of the organisations who decide whether we're being an ethical lender, for example. We use data on our whistleblowing scheme, which is called Speak Up. We use data on our own operations carbon footprint, data on customer data, whether our customers are feeling that we're a trustworthy organisation and the people that they want to bank with. Learning statistics, whether our people internally are taking up the opportunity to learn beyond just their role, and a wide variety across this sort of 120 different metrics, to try and pull those together into a kind of coherent format that can give our senior stakeholders the information they need to fulfill their duty as a board and as an executive committee to understand the culture, discuss the culture of the organisation, and make adjustments to course if required. So it's a long journey. It's not by any way the finished article, and I think when I'm doing these reports twice a year for the last 5-6 years, no two reports, one after the other, has been the same as the previous one, because as somebody said to me recently, it's always good to be in a state of constant beta. So you're kind of always developing, doing what you can right now with the sort of minimum viable product, and then moving it on to the next iteration. And the next place we want to go to with this, which will be challenging, is to make far more use of predictive analytics rather than backward-looking analytics. So what are the things that we can pinpoint that give us a true picture of, if we were to pull this lever now, it's going to have an impact in the future? Some of that we think we've got an idea about, but it's, again, it's a tricky thing to do, and we're learning about this all the time and finding our feet. You know, for example, we'd like to move into the arena of analysing electronic communication traffic across the organisation to find out if that's giving us information around, say, potential risks or potential red flags for the organisation, things that we could pick out and stop. But we've not cracked that yet, and we're at the foothills of it, and would like to work hard to find out what the art of the possible is.
Thank you, and that's definitely a very interesting potential development. And if anybody in the audience is kind of going on a similar journey or has
somebody who's cracked that one,
any thoughts to share on that, please do let us know. So yeah, Debbie, what was BAE's approach to assessing culture, and what do you think are the main challenges that you would like to tackle next, or perhaps the next main developments of your approach?
Well, it's probably relatively similar to the way Roger's described it, and following on from some of the things Daniel said. So yes, we monitor obviously what's coming through the ethics helpline. Both, are we getting calls, what type of calls, and where are those things happening? When I'm talking to the board or the exec, I always say the ethics helpline is a bit like checking the pipes unblocked. If you're getting a number of calls through, then it says that people know what the standards are, know how to raise issues, and will raise issues. One of the things which is quite interesting, this was just more sort of anecdotal thing looking at, if you look back at the sort of issues that we got raised, I don't know, 10 years ago versus what we get now, I'd say some of the things we get now are far more behavioural, and to my mind show that our employees expect a higher standard. So it used to be sort of more the clear cut, the sort of I don't know, I saw somebody taking something off a desk. Whereas now it's somebody used a tone of voice that I didn't think was quite right, or the way they were speaking wasn't appropriate in that thing. So I think you can see a trend through that, but that's a pretty subjective way of doing it. So one of the things we're doing, and we haven't got the 120 metrics Roger referred to, but we are trying to triage different data streams. So looking across things like absence, attrition, safety incidents, calls to our employee assistance program, all of those things that would indicate the level of engagement with the workforce. If you've got an engaged workforce, they're likely to sort of be keen to uphold the standards, make things right, do things in the right way, ask what's going on before they have a go at doing it. So all of those are indications of engagement and the right thing. And by triaging those, ideally it won't get us quite into that predictive analysis, but would get us into being able to spot trouble points. What's going on there? There's sort of safety issues as well as absence issues. Hang on, ethics calls are raising as well. That's something more than just an isolated incident. So looking for those trends is very important, but then also trying to put the data into the, okay, so what's the earliest indicator of something going wrong in an area? Is it calls coming through to the ethics helpline, or is it actually an engagement survey that says people are saying they want to look for another job? Trying to get some sense of when something's not right in a team or in an area, what is the first thing that will be the thing to give? Oh, it looks like somebody's fixing something on the window behind me, so apologies for that one. Anyway, yes, so all of those is what we're doing. The Holy Grail is, of course, to get those predictive or leading indicators, something that would actually say where things might go wrong. And the bit that Roger referred to about email traffic, I do think we're working in a more virtual world, an IT-enabled world, and looking at what are the ethical issues that are going to be more associated with that remote working. I think engagement is one of them. And also me sat here can be doing all sorts of things that nobody knows. My boss doesn't know if I'm running a business on the side, or sending messages to something else or whatever. So I think we need to look at those and how we use IT data and information to measure things as well. Not just the traffic and adherence to the regulations over email, but also the content of them. I mean, there's some very powerful tools out there, but you also don't want to get into spying on employees either. Otherwise, that's a very different ethical world that would be in. So it's a range of things, but I think trying to use the data you have and triage it to say, what have you got, and represent it. Infographics and visualization tools also really helpful. How many ethics calls per employee in an area, just in big circles to show to the board, gets their attention. Why is that particular area in the Northwest? Why is that suddenly twice the size of somewhere? So I think there's a whole bunch of things we can do to get the data across and measure it, but it's ongoing.
Thanks very much. Roger, sorry, did you want to say something?
No, it's okay. It was covered. Thanks.
Excellent.
It was really just the point about, the accusation of spying on people's kind of email or instant message traffic worries me as we move into this analysis of electronic traffic. How do we make sure we are not spying, but we're using anything like any artificial intelligence for good rather than for evil? Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
So Daniel, actually, a question that I have for you a question from our listeners is about leadership. And as I mentioned, we had a few comments about potential issues with leaders that don't engage as they should or are not as supportive as they could to issues around culture and culture change. But from your research, would you have any suggestions or advice about how to deal with situations where the leadership is not as engaged there? What could be done to get them on board a bit more, or anything along those lines?
Thank you, Gwen. So I think that this is a really interesting challenge. I think that I can imagine the challenge operating in two ways. One is when you have a senior leader who is wondering why the subordinates are not sufficiently engaged with the values and the norms of the organization. Another one, of course, is the challenge of the head of culture in the organization, who may find that over in the business, in a different unit of the organization, perhaps there isn't the same level of interest and focus on culture. So I would say, from the standpoint of the senior leaders, the answer is very simple, which is that the values and the norms simply need to be a priority. And if the senior leadership is serious about the claims and the goals that they state, the values that they are putting forth for the organization, then there need to be consequences. It goes back to the point made by Debbie. Who is getting promoted and why? And so I think that it used to be the case that it was only financial and economic indicators that were being used for promotion. Clearly, this leads to a situation where organizations end up promoting people that do not adhere to the norms and the values of the organization. So I would say that fit with the norms and the ethics of the organization is critical in considering promotion decisions. And if that's not there, then that needs to be there. So that's from the standpoint of the senior management. From the standpoint of the culture unit, I think that this is a real challenge because at least what I saw in the bank that I followed is that the thrust for cultural reform really has to come from the top, and it has to work its way through the management. So if the management is uninterested, then no amount of efforts on the part of the culture team are going to be enough. And so I would say that it really has to be the managers that are keen on this.
Thank you, Daniel. That's very helpful. A question for you, Debbie. Somebody asked, how can we integrate the ideas that you shared with us in a way that is consistent for a diverse global organization?
Assume by the reference to diverse there is the different rules in different countries, different approaches. I think it's just being, okay, BA Systems has its main operations, UK, US, Australia and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia obviously has different views and regulations in place, so particularly in regard to diversity, gender diversity, etc. So when we're talking about culture and standards, one of the questions we often get is, well, how do we apply the same standards? We're talking about inclusion and everybody having the same voice. And the thing is, you've got to be realistic and start from where the starting point is. It doesn't mean to say you can't set the aspiration of common standards. You have common what you can, and then you work with to say, okay, where can we go from here? So one of the successes we've got, if we go to Saudi Arabia, initially when we first introduced our code of conduct, we sort of had the one thing we were absolutely adamant about was it had to be the same code of conduct across the world, obviously translated into local language. But it's probably quite light at that point in order to mean it could land everywhere. But over the years, we've worked extensively with our customers and our employees out in Saudi to take away the myth of, oh, well, you can't say that here, to actually, you can say that here if you say it in a particular way. So I do think it's being pragmatic, but you do have to be clear about what standards you expect. And also separating, I think, out what's a standard because it's the way you do things in a particular country versus what's the principle you're trying to uphold. And therefore, how do you say it so it's universal? Yeah. And I'll come away from Saudi to just use something dealing with recently with our American colleagues, and wanted to put something about prompt payment in, which obviously is a familiar term in the UK, and they're going, no, we're not putting that into an official thing. What it actually is, prompt payment to my US colleagues, was that's you pay as soon as the invoice comes through rather than within the agreed contract terms of a month or whatever. And they're saying that's just not practical. So ever divided by a common language. And I think working through those things, they were absolutely up for the principle of you pay within contractual terms, you don't put suppliers, particularly small suppliers, exposed in this way. But finding out what the issue is and working through to what you can say is really important. So be pragmatic and reasonable and prepared to talk.
Thanks very much. That's really helpful. Roger, a question for you would be about on a sort of a practical level. So who drives the culture strategy within the organization? What function? Because we talked about different elements of it. You work obviously in HR, we talked about compliance, we talked about ethics. And then a point that was raised by a few of our listeners is a potential issue with coordinating the work of different functions that come together to work on the culture strategy. So I was wondering whether you had any thoughts that you could share on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the responsibility and accountability for culture in the organisation ultimately rests with both the board of the organisation and the executive committee. But in financial services, there's been obviously a lot of kind of rule-based and regulations in place, an agreement with the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority about which named executives specifically are accountable for the culture and to drive the culture in the organisation. And in NatWest, the named accountable executives are the Chief People and Transformation Officer and the Chief Risk Officer. So covering both those elements that you mentioned there about culture and compliance. So they're the named individuals who, if something goes wrong, the regulator would come and, you know, interrogate, speak to. But it's not just them. It's the entire executive committee who are responsible for making sure that the culture moves in the correct direction. And to Daniel's point earlier, that's all very well, but it's no use that somebody sitting in a kind of head office ivory tower feels that they've got responsibility for the culture if that doesn't permeate right through the organization. So it has to be everybody's responsibility to make sure that they are guided by what our purpose is and what our code is, to make sure that we are all on board with this. And again, you know, we're not naive enough to believe that everybody's going to be on board, you know, all the time with this. There'll be people who disagree with things. There'll be people who, you know, just can't be bothered with it. But it's trying to communicate effectively enough, show the tone from the top that allows people to get on board with what we're trying to achieve and become passionate about it themselves if they can. I remember some time ago when we introduced the consistent values that I mentioned earlier, there was a little bit of a mini backlash at the time. And the backlash was not because people thought that the values that we'd introduced were wrong. Everybody agreed, and they've been part of a kind of organization-wide development and consultation process to come up with the right language. But the backlash came because some people felt here is a set of values that's being proclaimed from the center of the organization out to, you know, people working in branches, call centers, and what have you, saying, why are you telling us this? This is what I have been doing in my entire career, and you're now telling me I have to adhere to these values. So that was a kind of interesting cultural backlash, if you like, about people saying, you're just telling me what I'm doing already. You've put it on a piece of paper or a poster on a wall. This is what I have been doing to serve customers, to, you know, uphold the highest standards and doing the right thing all the time. You're telling me what I'm already doing. So, you know, don't tell me, because that's what I do already. So it's getting that tone right, getting the message alignment throughout the organization so that people can all kind of buy into it. Sorry, what was the second part of the question, Gwen? I'm not sure if I've answered that.
Yeah. So it was about the communication between all the different actors involved and stakeholders involved, and make sure that this happens.
It's a constant process. It's not just here's our values or here's our new purpose, right, go and get on with it. It has to be part of everything we do. And you know, for example, purpose, which I've mentioned a few times, about championing families, businesses, communities to thrive. That message is threaded through everything that we do, from, you know, presentations to shareholders on our results day, to communications that go to staff about changes in policy, to publicly held town halls that leaders do for their colleagues across different businesses. That purpose message and that those values are threaded throughout all those communications. So it never stops. It's not just a one-off, here it is, take it or leave it. It's a constant reinforcement through all communications.
Thank you. And somebody in our audience actually agrees with you, Roger. It says, well, very well articulated with regards to the exasperation of being told from above to do what good staff have long have been already doing. So
nobody likes to be told that, you know, do this when you're already doing it. It's so frustrating. So I could get exactly why we had, and I wouldn't say it was a mistake, but what happened was, just as a little bit of a corporate communication story. These values, as I say, had been worked on by a huge number of people right across the organization for a very long time. And then I think it was a Monday launch date officially for these on communication sites, websites, etc. internally. On the weekend before the official launch, each individual got to their home address a nice little kind of glossy brochure with here are the values on it. And that actually caused a bit of a backlash as well, because A, you're telling us what we're doing already, and B, why have you wasted money on this when we're doing it already? So it's kind of fascinating how people receive the messages, much as that was all very well intentioned and wanted to create a bit of a kind of excitement about the communication of the new values.
No, that's a very interesting point, actually. Yes, Daniel.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, this problem that Roger has just highlighted, which is that the bank may well be able to produce the best possible set of values, and yet that then leads to a backslash. And I think that this speaks to a distinction that Debbie raised between a small organization and a large organization. And let's keep in mind that there are some really very, very large organizations, particularly in the financial sector, which is, the sector that I typically study. And so it turns the work of these central roles such as culture, HR, risk management into a real center periphery dynamic that, it almost reminds me of, the old empires in which you had, the center and then a sometimes very remote periphery, abroad, different countries far away. And so how do you then make sure that there is consistency between these? Because the same word can also be misinterpreted and interpreted very differently in another part of the organization. So this, for instance, would be a case where qualitative research might uncover differences in the way that, say, a specific word is interpreted.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And perhaps, Daniel, actually, one of our listeners says, what resources would the panel recommend for a novice in building to understand a bit better where to start, let's say, in building an ethical culture? And they mention readings or training, etc. So would you have any advice in that regards, where to start?
So I think one great place to go, in addition, of course, to the Institute for Business Ethics, would be the Financial Services Culture Board. If you Google FCCB, if you then add culture, you'll come across a cultural toolkit that I developed in conjunction with the FSCB, in which we lay out what is culture, how can it be studied, and the ways in which managers might be able to draw on their day-to-day observation to be able to slowly develop a systematic way of engaging with it.
Thank you very much. Debbie, actually, a quick question for you. Well, quick, I'm not sure, it's very broad, actually, but if you can address it quickly in the time that we have left. Somebody says, as large companies such as NatWest and BAE, to what extent does corporate ethical policies extend to suppliers and across the value chain? So how easy it is to engage on cultural issues with people that are external to the organization?
Well, we do that, obviously. Well, sorry, let me give a bit of 70% of our turnover goes through our supply chain, so it's huge. And we're talking 10 billion a year in terms of value going through it. Our suppliers range from things the size of Rolls-Royce and a Lockheed Martin to a small specialist niche company. So absolutely, our supply chain, it's important that they don't expose, they're not a risk to us, but equally that we're behaving right to them, and that we're working with them to uphold the standards across the industry. Do tend to take the thing that across the sector, if one fails, it reflects on us all. So we have our supplier principles, which go out to all our suppliers, which state the standards we expect. We then based on a risk profile, we'll then engage more directly. We have 100 top suppliers, which is by value, but then we have a risk profiling that says which of those suppliers are more likely to be exposed to certain issues. It may not be ethical, it may be, say, environmental issues, it could be all sorts of things. And then we focus it on that. Now, as I said, it's a huge supply chain. We haven't been able to do that detailed engagement with all yet. We're rolling it out. And yes, there are tools we can use, the screening tools and all those sort of things. But I think there's no substitute for that direct engagement and training up our procurement people to have that and to be able to understand the information they're getting back. So yes, they're really, really important. It is a risk and an opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that sort of direct engagement seems quite helpful across the board when we talk about culture, because it emerges in many different points. So Roger and then Daniel, yeah.
Yeah, very similar to what Debbie said. We launched a supplier charter September 2020, which does many of the things that Debbie talked about. And we want to make sure that, as Debbie said, we are treating our suppliers as fairly as possible. So we obviously adhere to that. And we want our suppliers to be sound in terms of the principles of this charter as well. And make sure that we measure whether that's happening or not. And to Debbie's point about a risk assessment, if there's a supplier who's not on board with the same standards and that we would expect of ourselves, then there'll be conversations had about that.
Thank you, Roger. Daniel.
Yes, I thought it was a really important question. And one thing that I wanted to bring to people's attention is the importance of a very simple tool that managers have at their disposal, which is to listen and be aware of and do something about the ethical judgment that the people that you engage with are oftentimes communicating and transmitting. And so, you know, you meet with people, you talk to people, you see how they talk to each other, you see how they refer to others, you see to what extent are they just sound ethical individuals or not. And if I was an executive and I was in meetings with a supplier and I saw them not treating each other ethically, then it's really important to be able to connect with that feeling, that perception, and then do something about it, rather than wait for something to then take place, and at which time it clearly can be too late.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and it is important to feel that you can raise this issue internally, and you'll be listened to. And just very briefly, I just wanted to address one comment that we got in the chat, and it is about actually issues with raising concerns, because Malcolm actually quotes some research that we have done, the Ethics at Work survey, and we found out that 43% of respondents said that they experienced retaliation when they raised an ethical issue. So I was wondering whether any of you has any quick suggestions, just the final words about whether this is integrated into the things that you track to monitor culture, or if you have any thoughts about that. Roger, would you like to start?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I know that people are always very fearful of raising issues because of that potential they feel of retaliation. That, you know, won't be tolerated within NatWest, and we have both an executive who looks after our whistleblowing scheme, and also a board member who very publicly has articulated what the standards are in this regard. And all employees go through compliance training, if you like, around whistleblowing and speak up every year. So the organisation should be left in no doubt that retaliation type behaviour is not tolerated. And there's some well-documented cases of in financial services where people have been, singled out because they've raised issues, and they're used as examples of bad practice, not just by us, but by other organisations too. So we do track it. We track all our whistleblowing cases, the type. We look for patterns and trends in those. Obviously, they're all they're anonymous, but we look to see if there's a particular thing around bullying or retaliation, and make sure that anything like that is highlighted and raised. But we make sure people are trained to know that they can't, they have to take it seriously, and they can't target a whistleblower in any way at all.
Thank you very much. Any final thoughts from Daniel and Debbie? Either of you would like to add anything?
The one thing that I would add is that whistleblowers are a key complement to the normal means that an organization has to enforce ethics. But one should not lose track of the fact that it's the actual hierarchy and the management that are the key way. And so if there is this perception that there will be retaliation, I think that the problem is not just the whistleblowing, the problem is the managers themselves. And I would think that, it's sort of like it indicates a broader ethical problem.
Thank you. Debbie, anything from you?
Only to reinforce that you have to say, our statement comes from our chief exec saying retaliation will not be tolerated, but you have to, what we're trying to do ever more is when we're sort of closing cases out, is to say to the people who raise them, sort of do check back in with us, do make sure, and don't want to prolong the conversation, but I think there's a difference between sort of saying, okay, real retaliation versus maybe perceived, because somebody once having raised it, things, it's about a colleague, a team, it's very difficult for things to go back to how they were.
Yeah.
And that's human behavior, and it's not necessarily retaliation, it's just, it needs working through, and the company shouldn't ignore that one either.
Thanks very much, Debbie, and thank you to the three of you, Roger Farley, Daniel Beunza, and Debbie Allen, for being with us today. I'm afraid that's all we had time for. I hope you all enjoyed the discussion, and apologies if we couldn't answer to all the questions that you posed, but thanks for your participation to everyone who attended today as well. Just very briefly, before the end of the year at the IB, we have a couple of events lined up. One is a masterclass on effective ethics training, which will take place on the 9th of December. So if you're interested, you can sign up and find more information on our website. And then on the 16th of December, we have the Leading Sustainably and Ethically Global Perspective 2021, where we will discuss the results of the 2021 survey of corporate chief executive officers conducted by the global consultancy Accenture in partnership with the UN Global Compact. Thank you again for participating. We would love to receive your feedback. And so after the webinar, we will share a brief survey for you to complete. And so nothing else for me to add apart from saying goodbye, and we hope to see you again very soon.